Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Development Discourse, where we ideate for Africa's development. My name is Patrick Okibo, founding partner Nextier. Nextier is a multi-competency firm focused on solving Africa's complex development challenges. Now, Nigeria, Africa's largest economy, faces significant socioeconomic and political challenges. What are the root causes of this, of the country's current predicament? How did we arrive at this point? What are the building blocks to grow the economy? What have previous governments done but been unable to achieve and sustain double-digit growth? What are the key levers for the new administration? My guest today should have all the answers, right? Dr. Tayo Adeloju is the Chief Executive Officer at the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, the country's premier think tank. Tayo is a scholar, practitioner, economist, policy entrepreneur, and strategist. 3 or 4 former Nigerian presidents, Obasanjo, Yar'Adua, Jonathan, and Buhari, appointed him to various advisory roles. He has stellar academic qualifications, a master's degree in data economics and development policy from MIT, a master's in public administration from Walden, an MBA and Doctor of Business Administration from the Commonwealth University of Business and Technology. His PhD is in economic policy and public administration from Rushmore University. He holds several fellowships with a focus on Africa and the Middle East. Tayo, welcome.
Thanks, Patrick, for having me. It's like coming home, so it's a pleasure to be here.
Excellent, excellent. Let's start from the beginning. Now, the country's socioeconomic picture is not great. Almost 40% poverty rate, 32% inflation rate, super high unemployment rate, negative real returns on investment, food poverty, insecurity. Help us understand, what are the root causes of Nigeria's economic woes? Just wrap it up for us.
Well, I think when you think of how any country at all becomes economically successful, there are a few parameters, right? In a perfect world, like we say in economics, when all things are equal, every country is aiming for high and stable economic growth, and low inflation, stable price levels, and normally you want as low as possible unemployment and a favorable, current account, which impacts your exchange rates, as the case may be. So unfortunately, Nigeria's story has never been one of that perfect world, as it were. Key binding constraints have been consistent. One, are 3 types of structural problems: an over-dependence on oil, what we call oil-led dynamics. Nigeria has been through 5 recessions since 1960. Every one of those recessions have been triggered by commodity shock, by oil, by the dependence on oil. And so in 60 plus years, 5 recessions, I think by now we should get the memo. As long as we have an economy where the revenue is dependent on oil for the most, we will remain vulnerable to massive shocks like we have seen. And so that's the first structural problem. The second structural problem is that the size of the informal sector remains significantly the larger part of the Nigerian economy. Depending on who you ask, it's between 80 to 90%. Actually, we think that we don't know. So one of the things that the NESG hopes we will do this year and next year is to actually do the complete mapping of the informal sector economy. What's the real size? What's the structure? What's the nature? What's the component of that? So that's number 2. Number 3 characteristics of the structure is that we have historically, as a country, in terms of the size of spent more money on recurrent expenditure than capital expenditure, which means we are not investing enough in the factors that drive, productivity and competitiveness. Our own national infrastructure master plan says that it will take us 300 years at the current rate of spend to get to world-class infrastructure in Nigeria.
Yep.
And so that's that third component, which automatically creates bigger problems, because once you're not doing capital expenditure and driving the investment, your factors of production, you don't remain competitive. So even when Nigeria was growing, we've had two interesting decades since we returned to democracy in 1999. In our first decade, we were growing, I think we hit 14% growth rate some years.
1 year.
Yeah. But even in our decade of growth, the growth was structurally uninclusive. It was jobless growth for the most. And that's because the sectors that were growing could not transmit the value from that growth into the sectors that needed to absorb jobs, because we're spending the bulk of our money on recurrent and not capital. So I think when you look at these factors, right, it tells why that ambition of macroeconomic, expansive type growth, stability has not happened. Then automatically you ask the question about who's making the choices, right? Because the economy is not making the choices by itself. We have managers of the economy in the last 6 decades that are making the choices about what Nigeria will do, how it will spend its resources, what it will save, where it will invest, how much it will borrow, what it will spend borrowed money on. And all those choices are actually the drivers ultimately of our success, or in the words you use, our woes. Yeah. So we are here by choice.
Interesting. And I think you've touched on the big issues, and you landed on, you call the people that make the choices, let me term that as leadership, right? So I'd like to understand, and you mentioned the high growth rate in our first decade of democracy. In fact, there was a time we steadied at about 7% for about a decade. In your view, what were the building blocks for that? What enabled us? Because we haven't changed as Nigerians. It's the same set of human beings. It's the same air we breathe. It's the same dependence on oil. But we're able to achieve 7% GDP growth year on year. What drove that? And how come we're not seeing that today?
Okay, so to be honest, I want to be both fair and brutal with, our economic managers of the past and the present. You have some luck, right? Yeah. Growth always has some luck. And the luck is, if you're in Nigeria and you're prosecuting a season where oil is doing better, you are in a boom. A boom gives you a broad set of resources to play with. Some smart choices then help, right? Now, if you're prosecuting economic management in Nigeria and you're not in a boom, you don't have some smart choices, well, you just create a deeper hole. So in the first decade, straight out of military rule, we had President Obasanjo, and if you remember, 4 things came together. One was that there was a general global excitement that Nigeria was back to democratic rule. That was a big plus for President Obasanjo. It gave him the honeymoon period to decide what to do with talking to the international partners. And every president gets this honeymoon. It lasts about 12 months, 15 months thereabout. And within that honeymoon period, as a president and an economic team you form, you need to decide, what do you say to the rest of the world? This is important. Second is, his economic team decided very quickly that the best use of the honeymoon period was debt forgiveness, which was at the top of the agenda, fiscal prudential controls at home, something that showed real pivots to fiscal discipline. And the third, which people don't pay attention to, is what to do with assets that were underperforming. The biggest set of choices that were made in 1999 and 2006 was about assets. How do you make more assets sweat? I keep saying that, look, if you and I had the same papa, and in his passing on, he handed us over Nigeria. We will be sitting on maybe $4 to $15 trillion worth of assets. Now, if we had a loan of about $100 billion, you and I would have figured out how to make some assets where to pay the loan. Unfortunately, Nigeria does not operate like a nicely oiled family. It's way more difficult than that to make assets sweat. But President Obasanjo's government, or that period, the managers of that period, was smart about accelerating privatization to move government-owned enterprises that were monopolies in big sectors that could be productive out of the way. Liberalization was happening across many sectors of the economy, and there was a lot of efficiency in moving that forward, including privatization of the seaport, liberalization of the telecommunication sector, and those were the, beyond the oil revenues, these were the drivers of FDI. Okay, and that's the other big message of the first decade. It was the amount of expansive focus on bringing new investments in. Now, you can't bring new investments in if you do not have an investment promotion agenda, a well-packaged set of FDI projects that have been de-risked and ready for international marketing. FDI markets are very sensitive to the quality of investment-grade projects. So we had better packaged investment-grade projects in the first decade. And the result was we saw more FDI come in, and we saw a pipeline of FDI that stayed around 60 or 70 billion per time, year on year. In other words, you're negotiating at any point in time $50 to $60 billion, and you're onboarding of that about 7 to 8 billion year on year. Now, that's only possible with that kind of expansive, very aggressive, very bold agenda. And remember that President Obasanjo asked us at the Economic Summit in 2002 that why are we waiting to 2025, to become an economic powerhouse? Let's do it by 2020. So you also need frontier development ambitions that are bold, that are galvanizing ministries, departments, and agencies, and an alignment on discipline of execution to getting things done. Now, people don't realize it, but we ran a subsidy at that time, a fiscal subsidy on petroleum products at that time. And the truth is that we were paying from subsidy from savings. We were not paying subsidies from debt or revenue. We're paying subsidies from savings. We maintained on an average foreign reserves that stood at about $50 to $60 billion, excess crude. So again, we were not eating all our oil revenues. Our oil revenues were in excess of 45 to 50 billion in excess crude accounts. And so we managed a surplus that created an excess. So I think the second part of that story is that we went into President Yar'Adua's government. And I think when President Yar'Adua came into office, reserves should have been sitting at about $62 billion or something. Excess crude was way above $55 billion. And, so we managed the subsidies until the managers of the economy had a brilliant idea in 2010, which was deplete all national savings because it belongs to the Federation. And so in that big Supreme Court fight between the governors and the president and the federal government, we depleted the excess crude account to just about $1 billion between 2010 and 2011. And so, of course, we entered 2011 with less savings, less fiscal buffers than we had historically in the first decade. And for the first time in a decade, we were now prone to shocks. Because the idea with the fiscal buffers and the savings was that because we were an economy prone to shock, the managers of the first decade built a fiscal buffer. So, like, for example, during the global financial crisis, the Yar'Adua government buffered the economy with $15 billion. Most Nigerians said that we were not part of the global financial system because we did not feel it. Now, yeah, but we did not feel it because we had a fiscal buffer, right? Now, fast forward to 2015, President Buhari comes on board. We have another shock, no fiscal buffer. And we felt it, we felt it, had enough to go into a recession of minus 1.6. So the fact is, there is some luck involved, But the lock requires that managers of the economy are paying attention to how the fiscal resources are deployed. Now, unfortunately, we moved from managing subsidy, for example, as a savings operation, a fiscal savings operation in the first decade. Under Jonathan, we moved to managing subsidy as a first-line charge on revenue. Because, of course, we had now depleted the fiscal buffers. And so by the time President Buhari came in 2015, the fiscal buffers, which were way gone before he got here, we were now subject to deficit financing by default because oil was lower for longer. Actually, oil went below the price of producing it. Correct. So imagine we went from savings fiscal operations to first line charge on revenue fiscal operations from 2011 to 2015 to deficit operations from 2015 to 2023. Then you ask, how did we get here? That's how we got here. You know? So the fiscal cliff that Nigerians discuss almost as something that happened overnight did not happen overnight. We went from managing our excess savings and our surpluses to manage to reducing that to we will always have revenue, so let's keep spending, to deficit. And remember that in the last decade, between two recessions and one pandemic, Nigeria basically borrowed its way out of all three crises.
Correct.
So I don't envy anybody that took an economic management.
The chicks are coming home to roost. Yeah. Okay. So we're going to come to some of the things the current administration, should be doing, could do, etc. But help us unpack some of the words and terms that are out there today. So even my grandma probably has heard of inflation and has heard of FX challenges. How do all of these tie together to explain what's happening to us today?
So, if you think of how you and I do business, let's pack Nigeria for a minute. You and I likely run a business where the financial statement is determined by certain indicators, right? The first indicator is very likely the assets that you are using to drive the products or services you produce.
Correct.
Right? An asset is an income earning opportunity or capability. So you measure a country's productivity more from what it's doing with its assets. Because ultimately the assets create the revenue, creates the income. It creates the economic opportunities from where you either can invest more in more assets or invest more in more benefits for your people, as the case may be. So the first, and I think I've made that first point, our assets in the last decade did not sweat. It did not perform. None of our major assets were performing at a level that guaranteed we could pay Nigeria to run.
Correct.
It would be similar to the way a business would run its assets, maybe a machine, and be unable to pay employees. So we've had a decade of that. A lot of the reasons why our assets have not fired are, some of them are philosophical. So for example, the idea of selling refineries that were not performing is something that's been here for decades, but we've refused to sell them, even though the maintenance and turnaround investment every decade is in something in excess of maybe $14 or $15 billion. But we keep the emotional commitment to the fact that we must keep assets that are not firing, and that's something that Nigerians must come to terms with. We will either have a set of national assets, seaports, airports, railways, gas infrastructure. NNPC is another great example of an asset, right, that potentially could perform as well as maybe the Saudi Aramco, right? But for a good part of 24 months, NNPC could not retire $1 to the Federation account.
Right.
And a big part of that, was that it was encumbered, all revenues were encumbered in liabilities. Liabilities, of course, is all the forms of borrowing commitments that a country incurs because its assets are not firing, it has less revenue that it needs to spend on expenditure. So it goes out and accumulates a set of debts or deficits it must pay for. And so on the liability side, our liability kept expanding, right? Assets were not firing, revenues kept coming down. And as a result of that, you then had a situation where the balance of the budget was always a huge deficit. In fact, if you remember that subsidy became, the fuel subsidy 2 years ago started getting close to matching the federal government budget.
Correct.
Right, in terms of size. Now, once you have liabilities of that size, three things happen automatically. One, as you pay for the cost of financing your liabilities, right, you create this high inflationary environment where the cost of everything keeps going up. And the Nigerian inflation structure has several fundamentals. With all our deficiencies, Nigeria has been able to keep inflation at 11% in our history before. So we've done it, we can do it. The problem is that in addition to the deficits that might keep inflation at 11 or 12%, we then have had accelerators of inflation. One was FX restriction. FX restrictions for the last decade drove inflation up year on year. We saw that. Trade restrictions, right? We closed our borders for a few years, a year plus, and the price of Nigerian-made goods went up as a result. Then you add to that a growing state of insecurity. In the last decade, the scale of national security crisis that impact value chains across every sector of the economy have grown. And next year is maybe one of the most brilliant connectors in terms of both assessing the ongoing chronology of national security threats and the proliferation of franchises of violence that create the alchemy of chaos, especially in security threats. But as a result of that, whether you are the smallholder farmer, whether you are solving for producing oil in the Niger Delta, you know, whether you are a business that is just moving your logistics between primary production and processing centers in the Northeast and the North Central, we are all now solving for some cost of business that comes from that challenge. So when you combine the factors, cost of exchange rate, cost of doing business, cost of interest rates, okay, which is impacted by how we manage the balance sheet, what we see is that we had inflationary accelerators on the rise into 2019. Then in 2020, we then had COVID. The whole world shut its border down. The cost of demand and supply across the world went up. That drove inflation up. And the only way you could have come out of that is to spend your way. If you remember that, whilst people say printing money is bad, even the NSG advocated for printing money during COVID because we had to feed Nigerians, the number of insecure Nigerians. We had to solve for homemade solutions. Well, as we came out of COVID, everybody thought we'll go into a period of recovery. Then came international, what we call the importation of inflation. Ukraine, Russia went into a war. Nigeria is heavily dependent on these two countries for wheat and fertilizer and maize to close our gap. And when these two countries went into war, they shocked the global system again. Post-COVID, this is now 2021, right? Yeah, 2021. And then, of course, the result of that was we were now doing Ukraine, Russia, international inflation on food. So the cost of maize, soya, rice, fertilizer, you know, everything, sunflower, palm oil, all, I mean, went up. And it didn't just go up here, it went up everywhere. right? And that carried food inflation into 2022. Now, as you know, in 2022, we were in a partial lame duck scenario. A government that was going, a government that needed to come, election year, pre-election year is usually a lame duck, almost a lame duck policy scenario. Very little to do. If you remember, President Buhari was going to remove subsidy, deferred it for 1 year to June 1st, 2023. And as a result of that, right, nothing really moved. We were just at the mercy of these inflation accelerators. And fourth quarter of 2022, CBN has a great idea. New Naira, the new Naira policy. Now, if we had spent 10 years accelerating digital penetration, we had spent 10 years deepening digital services to every nook and cranny in Nigeria, local economies, it would have been great. Yeah, but Nigerians were not ready. So a demonetization policy, right, basically drove most of the informal sector, most of the agrarian subsectors of the economy, many parts of the broken value chain, more into high cost of doing business. If you remember, farmers were trying to get cash and exchanging for every 10 naira, I think they were getting a value of 6 naira or 7 naira. We reported about this in January 2023. As a result, Nigeria underproduced food in 2023 because of the cultivatable land in 2023, about 31 million hectares of land. We did just touching 20 million hectares of land in the dry season farming of 2023. As a result of that, we anticipated, and I think NESG kept saying this, that by the time President Tinubu gets into office, he will have a food security crisis. So, of course, we enter June, President Tinubu wins the election, and the first thing that is hitting us is this acceleration of food inflation as a knock-on cost on headline inflation that comes from a gap between the production of food and the demand for food.
Sure. So let's.
So when people ask how do you describe inflation, Nigerian inflation is a set of accelerators. Where monetary policy now is a subset. Monetary policy system driven inflation is now a subset of the whole inflation. Yeah. And so very rightly, tightening of monetary policy rates today, whilst it will have an impact on some component of inflation, will not possibly solve for all of the inflationary accelerators that have been unleashed in the last decade. You need a whole of government approach that looks at each of the accelerators that we were stepping on and to start to tell people to stop stepping on them. And unfortunately, the political messaging that says we'll come out of this quickly, is not true. We didn't get here quickly. We won't come out quickly. We will come out with a steady set of disciplined, sequenced, clear forward guidance by incrementally showing confidence that we know what we are doing and that we can steady the course to do the hard work to get Nigeria back to the path of growth.
So let's switch a bit, right? Because I think we've done a good job of laying a shared understanding of how we got here, what we're dealing with right now. Now, new government in power, how should the government be thinking about the issues it's inherited and where it wants to go? Mindful that what we're facing is, and I think this is your term, a polycrisis. It's not an inflation problem. It's not an FX problem. It's a cornucopia of just a lot of issues coming together at the same time. So for the people who are dealing with policy today, what's a model, a framework that could be a good way of understanding what they're dealing with and how to approach a solution?
That's a brilliant question. And so if you and I were on the economic team, right, we have arrived in 2024 January or late 2023 quarter four. And by that time, to determine the outcomes of quarter four was already gone. So what have we inherited? With the exception of ICT, right? Financial services and maybe trade. Most of the sectors of the Nigerian, all the other productive sectors actually have stagnated, and oil and gas as a sector is in recession. Now, what that means is that even if you wanted to begin to solve for a problem, you don't even have the sectors firing at a level that allows you to immediately begin to discuss growth. You almost have to resuscitate sectors back into growth. So you need a stimulus plan to do it. That's number one. Number two, because economic momentum slowed down in 2023, to get economic momentum going, monetary and fiscal policy had to create a set of clear guidance. Again, because the economic team, for all intents and purposes, formed in the closing part of quarter four last year, right? It was the beginning of 2024 that we started to see clear guidance from the Monetary Policy Authority in terms of, where the bank was going to go with exchange rates. I think in December, if you asked what was the exchange rate regime going to be, nobody was going to be sure, but now we're sure, right? We've seen the Monetary Policy Authority keep its promises, right? At the Economic Summit, the CBN governor, who was, fresh off the mint, basically made a commitment to clear all backlogs, all FX backlogs that he met. I think last week, as part of the MPC meeting, he announced he had cleared all the legitimate backlogs. That type of forward guidance is crucial from the monetary policy side. But of course, beyond that, microprudential reforms that see the structuring of the financial or reorganization or regalvanization of the financial sector to respond to growth is crucial. So we're seeing banking consolidation now, but it's going to take more than banking consolidation, because remember that the banks are only one part of the financial sector. There are many other parts of the financial sector that needs to be regalvanized for driving growth. And bear in mind, they're trying to drive growth in sectors that are now seeing a macro risk pass-through that is basically characterized by very high costs. We had a session that cut across almost the entire organized private sector and MSMEs a few weeks ago. And there is no part of the economy that is not dealing with high costs in raw materials, high costs in logistics, high cost in distribution, high cost in production. So the question from the private sector is, how will the financial sector, for example, respond in terms of refinancing working capital, refinancing inventory, and how do you do that in an environment where NPR is being jacked up? You need to use development finance better. So there's some stuff to still do on the monetary policy side to be able to support that. On the fiscal side, the president was very clear that he wanted to balance the current account. That's something he said during the campaign, and it's something that he seems to be desperately wanting to do. And that means looking at your liabilities closely. Transparency is everything. I think the biggest thing we missed for years was transparency. For example, what was the size of the reserves? How much of the reserves were encumbered? What was the size of the backlogs? We only started to see what the numbers really were a few months ago. And that, I think, created a lack of confidence in terms of investments coming in. But I think as some of that goes through on the monetary side and the fiscal side, we'll start to see some changes. There's still a lot of transparency and accountability that needs to be seen on the liabilities side. Of course, you know the size of the forwards in terms of contracts that encumber future oil revenues is a big question. What is the size of the forwards? How many more years of forwards must we really pay to sort out backlog of deficits before we start to discuss growth.
Mm.
Then you discuss the revenue side. Now, on the revenue side, we have a revenue crisis, both in terms of domestic and external revenue. You must grow revenue to match the size of your problem. And the truth about the matter is that you're asking sectors that have now gone into stagnation to grow your revenues through taxation. You can see that that might be a challenge. And so you automatically must swing to external revenue. Now, with external revenue, your top earner is oil. You know, if you look at Nigeria's total volume of trade, maybe $54 billion worth of volume of trade, most of it is oil. We export more oil, and that's how we earn revenue. Non-oil is diversified and growing, but it's still very small. So on the fiscal side, the big question is, what assets can attract investments into Nigeria that we can package and de-risk to immediately create a line of sight to investment pipelines to assets? What type of trade expansion can we create that is non-oil, right? That begins to create oil, revenues that are not dependent on the oil-led dynamics, right? And then, of course, what kind of confidence do we create in the financial markets? Okay, that allows for hot money to arrive. So you need a combination of hot, warm, and cool money. You know, hot money is what goes into the portfolio financial investment. And as you can see, as the monetary policy becomes predictable, providing strong forward guidance, the PFIs will take care of themselves, right? But sure, remember that the financial markets are also responding to the strength of your local firms. It's been a bloody quarter 1. If you look at the reports that have come out of everywhere, NESG's private sector led. All my members are bleeding. You know, it's a massacre. And many of them are staying, hoping that what they will see from the fiscal and monetary policy side is strong forward guidance that allows them to make longer-term investments because of confidence in Nigeria. And for that to happen, we need to see an economic blueprint, okay, that has a strategy for economic consolidation between the next 12 to 16 months.
And I think you've landed where I want to focus my next question, which is, and in the build-up, in your earlier submissions, you said, under Obasanjo, we had a big, I think you called it a big galvanizing idea, right? What could be this big galvanizing idea for the new administration? Under Obasanjo, there was clarity on the philosophy, on the economic philosophy. It was very market-facing. What is it for this administration? You know, the administration, in a few things it said, has talked about asset sale. There's a lot of, you know, debates on how well we've done with the assets we sold in the past, and should we be selling the family jewels? Now, it's not just a philosophical question. I understand the philosophical challenge there. If you're a quasi-socialist leaning person, you know, you're like, keep the assets, it takes care of people. If you're like me, very market-facing, you'd be like, bring in the private sector folks who can run this well. But the reality is that some of the things we sold in the past haven't also fired, right? Yeah. So there are issues around our capacity as a people to do anything and do it right. There are issues around the ethics of selling those assets. You know, if you think about the oil and gas assets that we sold that are not producing today because the folks who bought those assets do not have either the technical or the financial to sweat them. So there are lots of questions here, but if you were sitting with Asiwaju today and, you know, you wanted to help him think through what is that big galvanizing idea that can pull all of Nigeria together and get us all to focus on delivering that, what could it be?
So two things. One is, unfortunately, whilst the productive sectors are stagnating, we are dealing with a social crisis. And what that means, unfortunately, and I say unfortunately because this is a perfect storm, you know, we are dealing with in excess of 133 million multidimensionally poor people plus, because that's the 2022 statistics.
Yep.
According to the World Bank, we ended last year with an additional 14 million monetary poor people, taking the number to about 104 monetary poor. According to the World Food Program, we are now in excess of 100 million food insecure Nigerians coping to eat maybe a meal a day. What that means is that you cannot pursue economic consolidation without social protection. And unfortunately, the increasing bill on social protection as the social conditions worsen will keep growing. So the strategy in a consolidation, or in a stabilization of Nigeria phase, which is where we are in, we're trying to stabilize macroeconomic indicators and stabilize social outcomes, is threefold. Number one, we have to find a way to create the kind of stimulus that allows productive sectors to move back to the margin of growth. Number two, we have to think about doing so without hurting the poor, because we already made two big moves. President Tinubu removed subsidy and unified FX at once, right? The intended or unintended consequences, depending on how you want to look at it, of that is still with us. And so the fact is that you have to tackle those two problems simultaneously with national security. All of this requires stronger institutions. So the problem President Tinubu can fix for first is to strengthen the managerial capacity of the public sector, strengthen the capacity of the teams that he's built to be able to solve for more difficult problems. And I say that because, look, the national security issue, for example, is everywhere. If you're the national security advisor today, you're solving for far more national security threats than any of your predecessors by a long shot, right? And what that means is that we must bring some more both technical know-how and some more resource into that. Unfortunately, we're doing all these things in a time where it's the same resources you need, right? So they're solving for national security because you need a strong state, and a strong state is not strong to the degree to which, or a state is not strong to the degree to which you can have a multifarious set of oligopolies of violence, as it were. A strong state usually has a monopoly of violence under the rule of law. And this expansion of franchises of violence needs to end. It needs to be confronted and halted. But if you are going to solve for immediate problems, you solve for the ones that affect your revenue first. For example, there's a whole architecture of risks that are impacting oil and gas revenues today, right? That's something that requires a national security operations. And I think that we are seeing production go up as the national security forces do a more surgical work in the oil-producing areas. Of course, that has a cost to it, but it's better if you were thinking of solving your problem, solve for that. Then you have to solve for land security because of food. 30% of the states reported last year that access to farmlands was an issue because of security. Now, if we're discussing jacking production up to match our national demand levels for the staples, rice, maize, soya, etc., you need to have access to farmlands, and farmers and those of investing in the agriculture sector need to know that not only their lives, but their investments will be protected. So you need to solve for that. Then you need to solve for social protection in a consistent way. Now, there's been a huge amount of palliatives unleashed by the government, but we need to see a lot of transparency and accountability, especially because in the first round of transitions, a lot of that went through state governments. If we are not seeing efficient institutions using scarce resources to do difficult work, and I think it's important to stress this, this work is difficult. Nothing we are saying, Patrick, on this call is easy to do, unfortunately. All the easy answers ended decades ago. From here forward, it's tough work, complex issues. And you see, when you're dealing with complexities like ours, created by a set of multiple causes and effects with multiple cascading consequences, all intersecting and interacting with one another to create higher order crisis and higher order threats, cannot be solved by one minister, cannot be solved by one president sitting by himself. No. The ministries or the ministers need to work in teams, in collective teams. And I know there's an economic team. There needs to be a social welfare team. There needs to be a national security team, and these teams need to be speaking to each other as to the higher order cascading consequences that are fusing together to create new problems, and working together in a less silo, more integrated approach, conscious that this may be the cabinet, President Tinubu's team may be the cabinet dealing with the most complex set of multi-factors and polycrisis in the history of Nigeria. And therefore, more needs to be brought to pull that together. But it's doable. It's doable because we are Nigerians. We are 1 out of every 5 Black men on earth is one of us. And we're brilliant, we're intelligent, we have the capacity to think through our problems. We have the competencies to tackle the impossible. We have the spirit for it. And these are solvable problems, but it's not easy work. You can't moonwalk through it. This is crisis level situations across multiple polycrisis points.
I was about to
start in a state of emergency on food, on health, on education, on the economy, and all teams have to have the same sense of urgency.
Excellent, excellent. In fact, as you were speaking, I was about to start shouting, "Preach on!" Like this is what we need to hear. But then I pulled myself back to reality, right? We have an implementation challenge. I hear this a lot from Nigerians. We've got all great ideas. Our problem is implementation. I tend to differ on the first part. I'm not sure all the ideas are great because you can have great ideas if you don't have the right data to build your thinking on, et cetera, et cetera. But let's even assume that they're right. Let's assume we've got the right ideas. Implementation is a challenge, right? There are 2 schools of thought on implementation. You can do a top-down, where you dictate what needs to happen, or you can do a bottom-up, where you reach out and you try to galvanize. And that's why I like that word you used. What's the big galvanizing idea, to help drive implementation. But you can also look at how the philosophy of implementation, right? You can look at how China, for instance, which was in a worse economic situation than we were back in the 1980s, but has in 4 decades exited about 1 billion people from poverty, grown the economy to become the 2nd largest in the world, poking America's eyes now, right? How did they do it? They basically broke down powers to the regions, right? So every constituting unit in China had its KPIs. And the better you did, the more reward you got. So if you were a political operative, if you drove GDP the fastest, you knew you were closer to joining, the Politburo. Yeah. Now, what is the implementation philosophy that we need in Nigeria? There's a lot of excitement around the Tinubu administration on this count. It's always talked about devolving powers, or whatever we tend to call it. Is that the way to go? Is it to push more to the states, right? And have the states and the local governments as the engines of economic growth, whilst the federal government focuses on 3 things, security, diplomacy, and something else, whilst you push everything else to the local governments and to the states. If that's the case, how would this work in practice? Or maybe you've got a different idea.
So China is a great example. What people don't realize about China is that China's biggest strength is its civil service.
Exactly.
The Chinese civil service is 2,000 years old. It's the first meritocracy in the civil service in the world. And so if you were born a peasant, the only one of the sure ways you could rise in China 2,000 years ago was go and pass the civil service exam and get in. From there on, performance will determine your future, right? And here's the thing: China is not a democracy, but it gets stuff done because its civil service has the capacity to execute. The president's rethink on the Orosanye report and the philosophy behind that report is crucial. Rationalize the size of government, make government fit for purpose, remove multiplicity of mandates, and you know, the truth is, Mr. President, if people need to go, let them go. You know, that you're going to rationalize and keep everybody. Not true. There is nowhere in the world where rationalizing keeps everybody. But the idea behind rationalization in the Orosanye government, by the way, it's not even new. You know, Mbanafo's 1950 commission on the civil service rationalized the civil service as we were moving from 1959 commission on the civil service, rationalized the civil service as we're moving from British rule to independence, and nobody burnt Nigeria down. The IBB reforms driven by Dotun Phillips, right? Basically rationalized government again, even though it was quickly reversed by Aide Commission because it eliminated the IBB model eliminated permanent secretaries, etc. So, but the point is there needs to be a full theory of change around making our public service efficient. Because here's the thing: if a Nigerian knows that an efficient public service will deliver specific public services to him as a Nigerian at the hospital, at the school, you know, to that degree, the Nigerian feels part of a system that works. The countries we go to and celebrate, okay, work basically because those countries deliver great services to the large population of their citizens. That will not be, that's basically galvanizing the public service to work. The second is authorize the private sector for expansive growth. Because, of course, the point you made, whilst the government wants to do more, the capacity to do more has been lacking. But here's the thing: we can't do it the way we did it before. We can't privatize assets to our friends and hope that the assets will work. Let's forget about it, right? If you want an asset to perform, and we saw it under the liberalization policy that birthed GSM Revolution, go through an international competitive bid that brings in people that have the know-how, the financial capacity, and then appoint a competent regulator to build and allow the market to flourish. That was how we created the GSM revolution. That's how we'll create the next revolution. Okay. The last thing about devolution of powers is that I'm a strong proponent for the devolution of powers within the context of a responsible sovereign. You know, the challenge with devolution of powers is that we don't realize that we've devolved a lot of power already. In 1999, when we entered democracy, most state governments went mad because for the first time in decades, governors could just sign off what was in their treasury. And as a result, we went through a period of a lack of accountability of state government. I think we've solved for that to a significant degree today. Okay, now we have electricity as something that has been devolved by the Constitution to the states. Let's see the states take that and run, right? I don't think we should be in a country discussing $50 billion export revenue and looking at the federal government. Every state in Nigeria, and I say this responsibly, has at least one thing they can develop at commercial quantity to export for $1 billion a year. Every state in Nigeria. If each state solves for $1 billion worth of export revenue, we'll be at $36 billion a year. And if that solving is non-oil, it means that no matter how bad the future is, we will be able to buffer that effect. That alone will be transformative. So a galvanizing big idea. Can we get 36 states of the Federation to get to take their destinies in their own hands and say, look, each of us will contribute to this balance of trade, $1 billion in export revenues from something we will call, some opportunity we will develop at home, package for the global economy and export. I think that by itself is a transformative idea. Imagine a state that is sitting on, 2 million or 3 million hectares of land. Say, look, we'll feed on maize and millet or on, cassava, we'll feed the rest of Nigeria. We'll primary produce, we'll process, we'll package, and we'll dispatch to the rest of Nigeria. That state can be
or even if you produce and you partner with another state that processes.
Another state to process. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Like Lagos is doing with, I think, Gombe, one of the states, where they buy all the from them.
Or Lake Rice, and like Lagos is about to do with Niger now. So the truth is, we need frontier development thinking, where the mandates of government to the people, to the private sector, and to itself is to stop waiting for some miracle to happen. But it needs all hands on deck, hands on, heads in. This is, like I said, this is tough work, but it's the work that we can do.
Let me say, to our participants, we're going to open it up for questions. If you have questions or comments, please put it in the Q&A tab. I will read out a question. I will attribute it to the person who posed it. But again, just maybe one more question to you, Tayo. There's nothing that you've shared here that's easy to do. Nothing, right? What should the president be doing right now to improve his ability to build a team that can do this difficult work? And I mean, I'm trying to get to the nitty-gritty here on getting stuff done. Everything the president would try to do, he's going to have to bring some political capital on the table. So these are big, challenging, but how would he go about it? So for instance, I supported the subsidy removal, right? And yes, it came with some pain, but it was the right thing to do. Maybe he could have built up the some of the palliatives first before doing it. But the challenge with that is, if he didn't do it on day one, that he maybe would not have done it, because as he waited, things would get worse. Or the amount of political capital he needed to bring would be more. So this is a guy, let's assume that he really wants to do stuff. How should he strengthen himself to be able to make these difficult decisions and put together a team that will help him do it?
So I think the first thing, at least for Mr. President, is he's done it already, right? He has a cabinet, and he's kind of structured the cabinet where there are two coordinating ministers, one for social welfare, one for the economy. We saw, and congratulations, by the way, you're on the Presidential Economic Coordination Council. So you should be, you're not part of the solution, I guess. And we've seen the president in the last week or two create this coordination architecture for the economy. I think that's a good start. These things tend to be very unwieldy if the political authorization does not come from the president. And here's what I think. I think that the president, my guess in listening to him is that he's a willing reformer. He wants to get these things done. But a willing reformer by himself gets nothing done. A willing reformer must deploy political authorization within clear mandates to a team to go get it done, and be willing to back those teams when the time comes, right? Especially in terms of political capital to do difficult things, okay? And I think that with the structure the president has created around the economy, we were likely going to see some of that. Now, some of the difficult work also includes managing the politics, because whether you like it or not, political patronage is a key component of how we do politics in Nigeria. Therefore, there are people that see the president as their president. Therefore, whilst he's solving for all these complex issues, he must be managing their specific political interests. He has to be upfront about what is possible, what is not possible to his political constituencies, especially because of the size of the fiscal space. But secondly, we must see the people he authorizes to act move with a greater sense of urgency. So by now, any minister who has been appointed will have finished reviewing their policies.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever they inherited, whatever they were reviewing, because you're in a crisis, you want to review these things quickly and have an agenda for action that is ready to go. I think the KPIs were signed late last year. So we're now ending Q1. Now we should see from, across board, clear policy direction, clear objectives, clear strategies that are linked together, and scoreboards in which to keep track as to how we are doing. So for example, we're in a food security crisis. What was the amount of land we cultivated during the dry season farming that just ended? Okay, so therefore, what is the size of the output we're expecting? What level of security coordination must we see to protect the farmlands we have cultivated and planted on? And how do we ensure that we have the security architecture to guarantee we can harvest what we planted, right? That's a clear set of actions that must happen over the next few months. If not, our dry season harvest is not secure. Now, we're preparing for wet season harvest. Wet season harvest, we need to truly, if we're serious, cultivate at least 15 to 20 million hectares of land across the country, both government intervention, private sector, and commercial and individuals. Now, to do that, is the input facilitation already going on? Is seed, fertilizer, credit, are these things been lined up to be ready to go? In real terms, this is not presidential level work. This is operational level task force type work, right? So I think the coordinating ministers and the coordinating axis of the problems should be where the center of urgency should be, and there has to be a movement from, short, long-term policy type cycles to very short-term action review cycles that happen almost on a monthly, weekly basis, managing the crisis and getting feedback. So feedback from the market, feedback from the economy, feedback from the citizens as to how well these are going. And you need that kind of almost war room scenario, as it were, right, to truly move the needle on many of these big polycrisis points. And like I said, unfortunately, none of this is easy.
Thank you, Tayo. We've got about 8 or so questions here, so I'm going to read them out. Maybe take a minute and a half to address them, and because I'm sure there'll be more questions coming on. This is from Dr. Bandele Amo. He says, what's the role of ethics in driving us through the growth path? Do you think that ethical gap is what affects the productivity of our leaders in governance in Nigeria? So that question of ethics, what role?
Dr. Bandele, ethics is a big issue in any country, right? And even all the Asian countries we point to where there was an economic miracle, if you listen to their leaders, they had to solve for corruption and big ethical issues. What you do is that you strengthen your rule of law institutions. And there are 3 rule of law institutions in particular that need to be strengthened. The first is the courts, and then the second is the police. Without the police being able to intervene in some of these areas, and without the courts being able to intervene, establishing and maintaining the rule of law is difficult. And as you can tell, in these 2 institutions I pointed to, a lot of reform is required. But you don't build an ethical environment from where we are today without strengthening the institutions to do so. Some signaling from the top really helps when ethical missteps happen and there's consequence management at the top. People learn faster as a general principle. Happened in Singapore, happened in Indonesia. If you want a society to learn faster, modeling of ethics or creating ethical conditions from the top matter. In the last 6 months, we've seen where certain things in the governance finance value chain have been questioned. The budgeting process, the disbursement process, the procurement process, the contract. All these are opportunities for ethics or corruption. Now, to the degree to which we strengthen these value chain, particularly the fiscal value chain, how money moves, right? It improves radically the ethics or the ethical center of a government. So if you ask me, I will pick strengthening the ethical messaging from the top in terms of consequence management and strengthen the governance value chain. So increase the transparency of the budgeting process and hold everyone accountable with consequence. Increase the transparency of the disbursement process, the allocation process, the spending process, the procurement process, the project and contracting process. And that in itself will reduce the opportunities for corruption and ethical violations.
Fantastic. And because you've mentioned corruption, let me go to this question from Esro Ajanya. Can we explore the significance and importance of corruption on developing and growing our economy? And how can we begin to address this? You know, so essentially, corruption is a problem. How do we address it? Over.
You know, to be honest, there are many forms of corruption. I do not think some forms of political corruption will go away tomorrow morning. And sorry if I have to be that blunt, especially because our electoral process and our party politics culture in Nigeria for now allows for patronage and patronage economies to exist. And what patronage economies are is large numbers of patrons that are investing in the political process and expecting a return on their investment in tangible terms. However, we can force political parties to shift from a patrimonial approach where winner takes all once they win to some more clientelist model where at least whoever is the beneficiary of government favors does government work. You know, most countries that moved to a purely ethical system didn't do it in one jump. You know, so what happens today is if a government wins at local government, state government, or federal, those that invested in the process say their government has come. And they think it is a tyranny of victory, the winner takes all. Now, the truth is, how do you move from that to something that even works, right? I think, again, is go back and strengthen the governance financing value chain so that whoever claims they are beneficiaries of government patronage still must be forced to comply to principles of transparency and accountability in how public resources are decided on and deployed. I think that's fundamentally where we must pass through towards dealing with corruption. At the end, you need a strong anti-corruption agencies, and they must have the backing, real political authorization to get difficult work done. Because as we saw in the first wave of anti-corruption campaigns in Nigeria post-1999, when a governor has dipped his hand in the treasury and you want to go after him, you literally must shut down the state to go after him, you know? And the institutions that need to respond to things like that need to know they have their backing. In the last few years, we saw some actors in government that the anti-corruption institutions wanted to hold accountable. And it was the architecture of government that still protected these actors. So at the end, political authorization to anti-corruption agencies and transparency in the governance process is the only way to improve the process with deep citizen accountability. Ultimately, when you change the electoral process and one vote, one man really counts and people can hold governments accountable at the polls, then the citizens have the ultimate weapon for political change. A regime that does not deliver does not come back.
And let me just add that corruption is a big challenge, you know, but corruption is not the only reason why economies or countries do not grow. We have seen countries where there's a lot of corruption, but they've grown. China still has a lot of corruption, you know, but it's growing. I just typed in the chat, there's a fantastic book by Yuan Ang, China's Gilded Age, you know, that shows the different types of corruption and that the effect of this corruption is not the same. You know, also my Substack, I did a review of the book, you know, where I tried to relate it to Nigeria. But there's another question here from Chugo Ayaji. Beyond a transformation of monetary and fiscal policies, as well as the need to transform our institutions, The issue remains a lack of political will, that word again, and a collective short-term mindset due to the need to fulfill basic current needs, or you can even add political pressures. That's mine. How can we transcend this mindset in the current climate? So how does a political class, a political elite, deal with the short-termist political pressures and still solve real long-term problems?
Well, I think the highest form of political will mobilization is within the political agenda itself. It naturally resonates with the actor that made the promises in that agenda. Okay, so if you ask the president what he wants to happen, of course, he wants to execute his political agenda and his renewed, in this case, his renewed hope agenda and its 8 priorities. Mm-hmm. Hidden in that agenda is the key to mobilizing political will. Mm. Now, the challenge is, how do you take that and activate it into unbreakable mandates of government, which, when not executed, will have consequence? Mm. That becomes the execution work, right? You must take that, cascade it, as the government has done, into ministerial KPIs. But ministers must cascade it beyond themselves to heads of departments, heads of agencies, and extra ministerial departments with clear targets on a month-by-month, quarterly basis to get execution going. So it's not just that the president must hold ministers accountable. Ministers must hold head of agencies accountable on a weekly, monthly basis, right? And this is why I said that China, it's not about that it doesn't have corruption, is that it has a strong civil service. Mm-hmm. If you issue a mandate at the top in China, be sure that in 48 hours, the ministries, the departments, the agencies will receive their own forward directives on execution. Be sure that somebody will hold everybody accountable on a monthly basis. Be sure that at the end of the year, people will have consequences in the performance period for what they did or did not do. That's how it works. The press, so when we say, the biggest capacity to mobilize political will is actually embedded in the political agenda itself. Okay, the secretary to the government of the federation, the head of service, the chief of staff to the president, these actors that hold what we call the cardinal political powers of mobilization in a presidential system, need to deploy those powers for the solving of monitoring and evaluation of execution in the short, medium, and long term. Now, because they deploy political will through the agenda, they must have a receptacle to measure, and there must be consequences. If non-performance is happening, it must either have an explanation for which it goes back up for the president to solve for, right, where they now need authorization to clear something blocking their way, or the consequence must be that you change the person and put somebody else, right? But that needs to happen. If you do not mobilize political agendas, political will means nothing. The president can will it all he wants at the top, but he can't solve it if the architecture of government does not will it at the different levels of government. So once the president wills it, as he has done, it goes to the policy level. Now the policy level must will it in terms of how policies are now readjusted to match the president's agenda, and they must then direct it forward. Heads of agencies must then receive clear matching orders. That's right. And if it doesn't happen, you too must go. If that happens down the chain, then people adjust their behavior in the direction of where political will is directed.
In fact, Tayo, I just again posted in the chat a great book that explains how China works, right? The title is The Rise and Fall of East, by, I'm going to mess up the name, Hushuang Yuan, but I typed it in the chat. And it says really that, it's the education system for the civil service that creates, that cadre of people who who can make the president, or in their case, the premier's, political will mean something, And he explains a few other things like the place of autocracy and stability and technology as explaining the rise of China. And also in the latter part of the book talks about how this could lead to the decline of China. But I think you touched on many of those issues. There's another question from my good friend Miani Buka, and he's like, what's the quotient of power devolution and local economy strengthening you think will be required to get these matters done? I picked that up because, again, I pushed here for a devolution of powers to the local and the states. So he's saying, how much of that needs to happen, for us to see these things work?
I think we almost need to see, so two things. One is I love the book you mentioned for two reasons. One is that in that book, right, what you see is that the administrative order is more important than the political order in China.
Correct.
Once the political order has had their annual meeting, and the targets have come out, the great conference that they just finished, where the national mandates have been declared, the administrative order kicks in. And the strength of a state is the administrative order. The administrative order is only as strong as their competence, but also, I know competence is not knowledge. Competence is knowledge, skill, attitude, character. Okay? And competence must be deployed to people that are rewarded properly to do their work. We pay civil servants peanuts. A permanent secretary who I deeply love once said to me, they behave as if they are paying us, we behave as if we are doing their work.
Like the Russians said, they pretend to pay us, we pretend we work.
Yes. Now, the challenge with that is, whilst we are demanding performance from the civil service, we must pay the civil service to perform. I would rather pay a highly competent civil service to perform and fire those that don't deliver than to keep a civil service that we pay peanuts and we hope they will work. And I think that a big conversation with the review of the Orosei report now is to rethink this piece. And by the way, we have almost 49 administrative service reform reports since 1949 that have argued for a competent, well-paid civil service. And unfortunately, almost 70 years later, we haven't achieved it. And so that's a big issue to solve for. But the question of the quotient between federal and state in terms of the devolution of power to prosecute developmental agendas, I would say that it has to be calibrated, at least to the degree to which each state, within the optimal maximization of its efforts, can contribute $1 billion to export revenues. And I say that because whatever that is, whatever that means in terms of what you must devolve, because the center is no longer able to do it. Whatever productive for its people and more contributory to the federation to begin its productive dimensions at the level of $1 billion in export revenue to a state. Now, of course, we know there are some states that will easily leave all of us behind, because some states can do, in terms of export revenues today, some states, if allowed, can easily do $4 or $5 billion. That's something that we need to look at. Yeah, the new China playbook is another interesting. Someone is reading a lot. I know I didn't give you a number.
So what I wanted to point out with this recommendation on, it's a great book, The New China Playbook by Qian Jin. And this is an answer to Miani's question. What they do in China is that the party sets what she calls the red line. So basically they say, this is what we want to achieve. And it's really around stability or absence of chaos, right? And then they leave the states to decide how to do it. You know, so Miani's question on what's the quotient, in my view, push it down, yeah? And then and then point the people to their governors, point the people to their local government chairman. Right now, all fingers are pointing at the president, but there is in my view, absolutely no way the president is going to sit in Abuja and figure out what the issues are in my local government and how to solve those issues, you know? So I think in our military past where the presidency kind of grabbed powers, you know, we're paying for it today because you have a democracy where you can't really do it. You can't really run a unitary government, you know, from the top. You need to devolve powers. And if we start working on our model, it'll be to probably set some broad targets and then let the states and the local governments, you know, drive those targets. There's another question here as we get into the last 10 minutes of our chat, you know, from Mohammed Danjuma. Why have we not been able to do a credible population census? How can we plan if we do not know the number of people we are planning for? I think knowing our numbers and other demographic indicators is a no-brainer for pragmatic planning and development. Should this be a top priority for this new administration from an economic planning point of view, even if we leave out the political for now?
So, and Patrick, you remember that I tried to drag you into this project a few years ago. We were